So first of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our event, Assuring AI Systems in the HR and Recruitment Sector. I'm Patrick Milnes. I'm a Senior Campaigns Advisor at the REC, and I lead on all of our work internally around the use of AI in recruitment. I'm thrilled that we're joined today by Kevin Butler from Centigy, Nuala Polo, and Sarah Darrall from the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. I'll allow them to introduce themselves fully in a moment. Just so you're all aware, this session is being recorded, and the full recording and any links and information will be sent out later. So if we could just move on. Yeah, the reason we're hosting this session today is because we are seeing an increase in the use of AI in the recruitment and HR sectors. Members have reached out to us to let us know about systems they're hearing that help them throughout the recruitment lifecycle, sourcing candidates, screening and interviewing those candidates as well, where AI technology can be used to streamline these processes. It's great because it does allow for efficiency and scalability and consistency in those processes. But what we need to also be aware of is where there are particular risks around using AI in this manner. And that's what Kevin, Nuala and Sarah are going to be able to talk us through today, how we can what those risks are and how they can be mitigated as well, to ensure that AI is used fairly across the recruitment industry and the HR sector. So in order to be able to use these systems, you need to learn about AI assurance, which is what hopefully you'll all find out a little bit about today. So that will be enough from me. I'll hand over to our panel of experts now, and we can get into the real detail of the system. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and hello, welcome to everyone joining this webinar. I'm very happy to see so many of you join live, and also thank you if you have joined for the recording. I'm Kevin Butler, and I'm founder and senior technology advisor at Centigy. Centigy provides clarity over the uncertainty that surrounds the ethical use of talent technology. And we are passionate about ensuring that people tech is fair on everyone. We monitor ethical regulatory compliance standards for people tech, and we work directly with recruiters and HR teams to help guide them to make valuable tech decisions. And that's probably why you're joining today. You're looking perhaps at how recruitment technology can help give you a competitive advantage to get you a better ROI on the technology stack that you've got. And we're hopefully will be able to arm you today with some of the questions that you can ask of your suppliers when selecting that technology, be it building it in-house or from a third party. One of the main benefits or reasons why our clients love working with us at Centigy is because we are impartial, and unbiased technology advice is highly valuable because it can help you gain a competitive edge. So joining me today on the panel are Sarah and Nuala from the CDEI, that's the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and they will present their research on ensuring the responsible use of AI systems in HR and recruitment, right? And including the findings from two reports. One Centigy contributed to, that's the Industry Temperature Check report, as well as the excellent Buyer's Guide for Tech, which is a collaboration between the CDEI and REC. I'll be back on a little bit later to wrap up at the end, and I'll highlight the assurance resources that you have in this space, right? These are free guides and resources that you have available to you to support you when procuring and deploying responsible technology. So the webinar should take about 45 minutes or so for the main body of it, with some time, hopefully at the end, for a Q&A session. We welcome your engagement throughout. There will be polls, so please vote in those polls. It's all fully anonymous. And if you have any questions at all, pop them in the chat, and we would love to tackle them at the end of the session. Okay, so when REC asked me to put this webinar together, I thought, well, who better to present than the government's expert team on AI at the CDEI. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nuala and Sarah. Take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin. So just really quickly, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the center before I talk a little bit more about what we do in terms of AI assurance and some of the research that we've been working on in this space. So the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation is a government expert body, and we really work to enable the trustworthy use of data and AI. So we're made up of kind of a multidisciplinary team of specialists, and we're trying to identify and tackle barriers to responsible innovation to ensure that we can really reap and maximize the benefits of these technologies, because we believe that there are loads of benefits while we're mitigating a lot of the potential risks. So my name is Nuala Polo. I'm a senior policy advisor at the center, and I work in our AI assurance program. And this program is really trying to promote the use of tools for trustworthy AI. So when we say that, we're referring to assurance techniques like impact assessment, bias audit, in the future maybe certification, as well as SEO developed standards, and looking at how these tools can help kind of support AI governance and ensure responsible innovation. Next slide, please. So what is AI assurance? I think to make sure that everybody's on the same page for this talk, it's helpful to provide a little bit of context and ask what we mean when we say this. So the goal of assurance ultimately is to build justified trust. And we want to really build confidence in a system by measuring, evaluating, and communicating something about that product, system, or service. And in the context of AI, we're talking about measuring, evaluating, and communicating whether or not that system is trustworthy in order to build trust with the end user or the customer and kind of get that justified trust in the systems that we want to be using. Next slide, please. So following publication of the government's national AI strategy in December 2021, CDEI published our AI assurance roadmap. And this set out kind of 6 key steps for us in terms of getting the UK to be a global leader in the emerging AI assurance space. So I'm not going to go into those in detail, but those steps are listed here, and that resource will be provided at the end of the webinar. But today, what I really want to focus on is some of the work that CDEI has been doing following the publication of that roadmap to try to understand how we can implement and operationalize this in practice to encourage the development of a world-leading AI assurance ecosystem in the UK. Next slide, please. So following publication of the roadmap, CDEI really focused on engaging with industry stakeholders because we're kind of saying at a high level, you know, assurance is important, we need to drive responsible innovation, but we wanted to understand kind of where that sits with industry and is that something that's already happening? So are organizations already using these tools and techniques? If so, how are they using them and how are they selecting them? And if not, what are some of the key barriers and how can CDEI kind of work to overcome these? So in the past year, year and a half, we had kind of 4 main engagement activities listed on this slide. And these included 2 ministerial roundtables. So we spoke to AI assurance service providers and AI developers. We had an AI assurance symposium with industry, which had kind of presentations, plenary discussions, interactive workshops to really kind of unpack and identify some of those key barriers. And we also had a series of semi-structured interviews and online surveys. And these focused on 3 sectors, which were HR and recruitment, finance, and connected and automated vehicles. And I think it's just worth noting that we selected these sectors kind of based on the breadth of risks posed by AI adoption. So in HR and recruitment, we're typically looking at kind of risks to fairness, discrimination, bias, etc. Whereas in finance and connected and automated vehicles, you face different risks more around kind of health and safety or cyber attack, for example. So we conducted these different kind of engagements and then did some thematic analysis to really identify what the key barriers in each of these sectors is, as well as exploring what some of the interventions could be to try to really kind of increase uptake of assurance tools and techniques in this space. So this past December, we published our industry temperature check, which summarizes the findings from these different engagements and sets out the barriers and enablers to AI assurance in these specific sectors. And obviously today, I'll be speaking just about kind of the findings that we had in the HR and recruitment sector. So next slide, please. Many of you will kind of know this already because you're working in this space, but in the HR and recruitment sector, AI adoption is becoming more and more prevalent kind of across the recruitment lifecycle. And as Patrick mentioned, it's used for a variety of tasks, including kind of sourcing, screening, interview, selection. And I just wanted to take a moment here to kind of better understand the people in this webinar right now, how you're using these tools, just to kind of see if it reflects some of the other research we've done. So I think there should be a poll that will come up on your screens that will ask you to tell us a little bit more about the way that you're using AI-enabled tools. So I'll just give you a minute to answer that. Okay, so far it seems overwhelmingly for sourcing. That's really interesting. I'll give one more minute because I think quite a few still haven't answered. Okay, that looks great. So really overwhelmingly, it looks like for sourcing and screening, which is really interesting. Thank you for that. Next slide, please. So in this sector, we think that the introduction of AI can be really, really beneficial, particularly as I'm sure you're aware, for sourcing and screening. It promises kind of greater efficiency, scalability, consistency, and takes a lot of kind of time and effort off of actual teams. However, the increased adoption of AI in the sector also is really likely to pose a number of different risks to individuals, particularly around kind of fairness, bias, and discrimination. So I've included some of those risks on this slide here, but again, I would refer to the report if you want to kind of unpack these in a little bit more detail. And this is really where we think kind of AI assurance comes into play. Next slide, please. Because we have these tools and technologies that can pose a number of amazing benefits. They can really kind of help to advance your processes and make your workload a little bit less kind of burdensome. But there's also a lot of risks to kind of rights-based harms. And so using AI assurance tools can really help to measure, evaluate, and communicate what these systems are doing, if they're doing it in a responsible way, and build that justified trust with your kind of end users and customers to ensure that these AI systems are really kind of doing what they say they're doing without hurting people or kind of causing risk to fairness, discrimination, bias, etc. Next slide, please. And sorry, the next one. So for the next kind of few minutes, I'm going to talk about the three major barriers that we identified to interacting with AI assurance techniques and tools in the HR and recruitment space. And then Sarah will talk a little bit about kind of the main CDEI intervention to really help mitigate some of these barriers. So again, we'll just do a quick poll, and it would be really interesting to know, for the AI-enabled tools that you're using in this space, do you typically develop these tools in-house, or do you procure them from a third-party provider, or is there something else not listed here? Yeah, okay, this is really interesting. Thank you to those who have answered. Given that 100% have said procuring tools from a third-party provider, I think we can move to the next slide and end that poll. But that is totally consistent with the research that we've done, and I think raises kind of a unique barrier in this space, in that many, if not all, in this call, participants in the HR and recruitment organizations are procuring these tools from third-party providers. They're not developing them in-house. And this means that typically individuals in these organizations have limited, if kind of any, AI expertise, and often assume if you're buying a product from a third-party provider, that supplier has kind of done the required checks and balances, they've put the safeguards in, and no additional kind of monitoring or evaluation will be necessary. So there's really just kind of this lack of knowledge and skills in the HR and recruitment sector around AI and responsible innovation, because people are buying those products from other places. And so in order to kind of try to overcome this barrier, participants in our research expressed a desire for more sector-specific guidance. So really clear guidance on, okay, if you're going to be procuring these technologies from a third-party provider, what are the questions that you need to be asking? What are the kind of processes that you need in place for once you've purchased that system in that ongoing kind of monitoring and evaluation? As an organization, what do you need to do in order to ensure that these technologies are used responsibly? So we've kind of tried to do something in this space, and CDEI has worked with REC to produce, I think, some really valuable guidance that is sector specific and focused just on procurement. And this is what Sarah will be speaking to in the second half of the presentation, but focusing on kind of responsible procurement of third-party tools in the HR and recruitment sector. But I think additional guidance in this space, particularly maybe for looking at not just recruitment, but employment technologies, would also be really valuable. Next slide, please. So the kind of second barrier that we identified, we'll go into here. Again, I think we'll start with a quick poll. So it'd be really interesting to understand, is there demand for responsible or ethical AI in your kind of sector or in your experience, and both trying to understand, is there internal demand? So do you have kind of senior leadership teams that are setting this as priority? Is there external demand, and that kind of customers or people that are applying for jobs are really asking to know more about these technologies? Is it coming from both sides, or is there not very much demand? I'll give maybe 10 more seconds. Okay, cool, thank you. So the results are kind of saying about tied between internal demand from senior leadership teams and no real demand at this point. So next slide, please. This is fairly consistent with the research, but I think the second real barrier that came out is that there is a lack of demand, particularly for smaller HR and recruitment organizations who need, capacity to invest in AI assurance tools. If there's not a lot of demand in this space, both from senior leadership teams or from customers, there's kind of a bit of a, why should I do this if it's going to take additional resource, time, money, etc., if nobody's really asking for it and if it's not that kind of important or priority. So in response to this barrier, participants said they really needed more education and upskilling around what the value of AI assurance is. So if I do an impact assessment, if I do a bias audit, how is that going to be beneficial? What does it kind of get me in the end? How will that build trust? And so there's really a need in this space to kind of raise awareness and grow demand of how valuable these tools can be in order to kind of promote the uptake of AI in this space. So CDEI did publish an AI assurance guide, which kind of speaks to the role of AI assurance techniques to really reap the benefits of AI systems while mitigating potential harms. But I think in general, just kind of more resources and educational awareness in this space. We call it assurance, other people call it responsible AI, other people call it risk management. There's a lot of kind of different terminology that's being used. So I think just kind of driving a stronger narrative around how important this is in an analogous way to what's been done in kind of the cybersecurity space is a really important kind of next step in growing demand for some of these services. And then I will go on to the final barrier that I'll speak about, and we'll have one more poll. Interested in your thoughts on this one. So here we're asking, sorry, just previous slide. Do you have clarity on how to assure systems in your sector? So I assume that most people are here because they have some questions, but do you feel like if you wanted to make sure that your systems are trustworthy, you know what the next steps are in order to do that? Yeah, so 100% no, which is great that you're all here. Oh, we have one yes. Okay, thank you. Overwhelmingly though, no. And I think this is, again, really consistent with the research that we've been doing. People want their systems to be fair, they want them to be transparent, they want them to be explainable, but they don't know what that means in practice, and they don't really know where to start. So next slide, please. So the last barrier we have is uncertainty. And in this space, there's actually kind of an interesting piece, particularly around regulatory uncertainty. So there's not a dedicated regulator in the UK for the HR and recruitment sector. It kind of falls under the remit of the AHRC, which is around obviously equality and human rights, but it also kind of falls in the remit of the ICO, which is around kind of data protection. So there's a little bit of confusion around who will be providing guidance or resource to help organizations in this space. And there's just a bit of confusion, yeah, A, around where to start, and B, around kind of who to go to for help and guidance. So in order to kind of start helping organizations in this space and overcome this barrier, the government will be publishing its white paper on AI regulation this spring. And this will, I think, set out a little bit more of a clear picture around the role of regulators and starting to operationalize and implement some of these high-level principles and outcomes for AI, like fairness, explainability, transparency, etc. But the government is also really kind of prioritizing collaboration with regulators to start understanding, how do we work with industry and organizations to really implement these principles in practice and understand kind of what these principles mean in different sectors, because fairness in HR and recruitment is really different than fairness in healthcare, for example. So starting to kind of break down what these high-level principles mean in different sectors with organizations. So that's kind of my spiel about some of the research we've done in terms of identifying barriers. And then I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who will speak to kind of the main intervention that CDEI has been working on the space, which, as I mentioned, is the kind of joint guidance with REC around the responsible procurement of AI systems in the HR and recruitment space.
Great, thanks, Nuala. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Darrall. I'm a senior policy advisor at CDEI and I work in our algorithmic transparency team. As I mentioned, I worked with Patrick and the REC team on the bias guidance, which I will run through now. So in 2021, the CDEI partnered with the Recruitment and Employment Confederation to develop a bespoke set of industry-led guidance. We combined our expertise on data-driven technology and associated ethical and policy issues with REC's deep knowledge of the recruitment industry, drawn from their broad industry membership, such as yourselves who are joining us today. So the resulting guidance aims to help recruiters be discerning buyers and confident, responsible users of a range of data-driven technologies in recruitment. It brings together law, standards and principles relevant to the use of data-driven tools in recruitment, with the aim of helping recruiters to take a holistic approach. This includes legal frameworks such as UK data protection law and equality law, as well as laws and industry guidelines around recruitment, including REC's own code of practice. Improved knowledge and awareness of the opportunities is crucial for the sector, and this work sets out in an accessible and clear way some of the technological options open to recruiters through the recruitment funnel. Our guidance recommends practical steps that should be taken to procure a data-driven tool, and it seeks to equip them with the mechanisms to effectively evaluate and responsibly deploy the tool, taking the appropriate steps to mitigate against risks and maximise opportunities to improve the recruitment process. Centrally, the guidance empowers recruiters to ask the right questions of vendors, ultimately driving the supply chain to consider these issues properly. Next slide, please. So the guidance is available on REC's website and it's open source, and it's split into two sections. So the first is an introduction to the data-driven tools used in recruitment processes and the kinds of risks they may bring. I won't focus on this section as Nuala's already outlined some of the key risks of the presentation, and I know many of you will already be aware of these from your experience in the sector. The second section goes into detail on the substance of the guidance, and that's where my section of the presentation will focus. Next slide, please. So just a quick note on how to use the guidance. Each section will have an explanation of why that particular element is important and what specific challenge it is seeking to address. Most sections will include information on the relevant frameworks and principles. And then there is a list of practical steps you can take towards the responsible procurement and deployment of recruitment tech. These steps are shown by the yellow stars throughout the deck. I would encourage you to read the guidance itself for more detail and context. So before you even head into the guidance, we highlight the level of assurance you apply to the procurement and usage of a data-driven tool should be proportional to the risk involved. The risk level exists on a spectrum. It's guided by the law, but also based on your professional judgment, and the guidance should be implemented to the degree that is proportional to that risk. You need to make sure that you know who in your organisation is responsible for taking the steps in the guidance, as well as who has overall responsibility for the process. This is likely to include a mixture of procurement teams, legal or compliance teams, senior managers, data protection officers, and others. And it might be that you identify someone internally to upskill or give them overall responsibility for ensuring compliance with the guidance. Where there are any questions or steps you do not feel qualified to answer or undertake, and you do not have the expertise in-house to support you, you should seek external expertise to ensure your procurement decision-making process is robust. Next slide, please. Okay, section 1 of the guidance focuses on evaluating the value and effectiveness of the tool. To set the context of the tool, you should set a clear vision of what you're hoping to achieve in using the tool and where it will sit within the recruitment process overall. This should include deciding whether you want the tool to make fully automated recruitment decisions or whether you intend to use the tool to support recruitment decision making. Some tools may help standardise assessments and address any bias in existing recruitment processes if used strategically, for example, to standardise the bar for entry at the first round of testing. They may also widen access to talent pipelines, help source candidates with particular skill sets, and reduce operational costs. You need to think carefully about what the intended benefit of using the tool is, and therefore how it should be incorporated. When writing down your proposed use case, this should include if and how the automated element will interact with manual steps and integrate with the wider process, and what the business need and objective is for procuring the tool. You should then use this information to assess the tool when deciding whether it meets your specifications during procurement. In terms of testing the functionality, you should ask the vendor what testing has been done to ensure the interface is accessible and functional for end users. What additional features or modifications are they planning to make in future versions of the tool? And can they detail examples of other customers who've used the tool effectively? And then, as listed here, it's advisable to have technical support built into the contract, so there's the option for troubleshooting support from the vendor should any technical problems arise. And then it's advisable to explore a pilot of the tool to understand how it operates in the context of your organisation. Next slide, please. The second section of the guidance is split into 4 parts, covering the key considerations for the use of data-driven tools. The first is accuracy and legitimate underlying science. It's important to understand what decision-making process the tool is automating. For example, is it sifting CVs or is it making decisions on interview outcomes? And to understand how the tool makes those decisions. Then your company can judge whether they're comfortable with the underlying assumptions made by the technology. For instance, if the tool is using game-based assessments to evaluate candidates, then ensure that the underlying science of those games is sound. The method of candidate evaluation should not be based on arbitrary factors or aspects of human behaviour. Above all, assessment should be linked to the skills needed for the job. When seeking information about the underlying science, be wary of any methods of assessment that are not based on high-quality scientific methods. In particular, tools that claim to infer human emotion from video interviews. You should avoid these, as evidence suggests they have substantial inaccuracies and are potentially discriminatory. Next slide, please. So the next section is on bias and discrimination. In data-driven tools, bias may emerge in two separate but related ways, which can compound to create cumulative bias. There is learned bias and inaccuracy. So learned bias is where data-driven tools learn how to make hiring decisions based on existing employment data. If there are patterns of bias in that data, then the data-driven tool is likely to repeat those patterns, which can lead to unfairness. And then inaccuracy is where tools that analyse face, speech or voice may be less accurate for particular demographic groups and introduce discrimination through simply working less well for those groups. Research has shown that facial recognition technology can be less accurate for people with darker skin, and particularly for women with darker skin. And tools that analyse aspects of voice or tone or that transcribe audio to text may be less accurate for certain accents or manners of speech. Good vendors will test their technology, for example, auditing and validating the underlying algorithm to protect against potential bias. Recruiters should demand this testing when looking to procure such tools. When seeking information from vendors, you should be aware that the UK populations may be different and that UK legal standards may not have been used. In particular, many vendors use the US relevant 4/5 rule to determine how much adverse impact is permissible. You'll need to decide if your team is comfortable with the vendor's results, keeping in mind that the context may be different. And if you test for bias yourself, remember that collecting and analysing demographic data for the purpose of testing fairness is permitted within the UK data protection law, where explicit consent has been provided. Next slide, please. In addition to bias and discrimination, data-driven tools can introduce accessibility issues for candidates with a disability, which may lead to unlawful discrimination. If a tool is not accessible or has functionality which makes it hard to use, this may also create discrimination. Addressing the accessibility of tools is as important as ensuring that they don't make biased decisions. For example, game-based assessments may be inaccessible to people with visual impairments. Interview-based assessments that use speech-to-text transcription or other audio processing may be inaccessible to people with certain speech impediments. And online recruitment tools might be difficult for older people to use if they've not used technology extensively in their working lives. Practically speaking, engaging with groups that represent the interests of people with disabilities and older people may include discussion with trade union equality officers. It may be difficult to collect enough data on accessibility for effective statistical analysis, so discussing the tool with groups may give greater insights on potential risks. If, as part of reasonable adjustments, you're offering an alternative process, make sure that the process is as robust as the data-driven approach, and then there is no bias against candidates who use this alternative process, and explain the reasonable adjustments clearly and transparently. When reflecting on your results, note that introducing tools which require people to request adjustments can introduce unfairness, simply because candidates with disabilities may not want to declare those disabilities for fear of stigma or disadvantage, or they may not understand enough about the system to understand whether it places them at a disadvantage such that they need assistance. Consider whether this will apply within your workplace context. Next slide, please. So the next section is on data protection, which I know is something you'll all be familiar with already. The guidance focuses on where there may be additional considerations to your business as usual practices. So data-driven tools in recruitment are very likely to require personal data and therefore engage data protection law. In addition, in order to monitor the hiring system's effect on protected groups, it will be necessary for the employer or the vendor to collect and analyse protected characteristic data on candidates, which is lawful where appropriate safeguards are in place. You should agree who has the role of data controller, the vendor, the recruiter, or both, before a procurement contract is signed. Controllers will be responsible for complying and demonstrating compliance with UK GDPR. You should ensure the vendor's practices comply with UK GDPR, and this includes understanding how your candidate's data will be used in the future. For example, if it's used to train the vendor's model, consent will be needed from candidates before they interact with the tool. And you should consider where there may be appropriate use of data minimization, so where only personal data needed for your purpose is collected. the identification techniques where identifying data is removed, or privacy enhancing technologies. Data collection should be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary, and robust processes should be in place for any data storage and mechanisms to delete data where necessary. In terms of completing a DPIA, you may want to complete this with the vendor. Beginning the DPIA as early as possible is advisable to assess and mitigate data protection risks at an early stage and keep them updated throughout. A DPIA must be done before any type of processing that is likely to result in a high risk. And it's good practice to publish the DPIA so it's accessible to applicants and workers. And finally, where protected characteristic data is being collected for equalities and fairness monitoring, you must ensure it is not accidentally leaking into the decision-making process, that it is kept ring-fenced and separate. Next slide, please. So the final element to this section is transparency and due process. Transparency is an important principle in the use of data-driven tech. Systems should be open to scrutiny with meaningful information provided to relevant individuals across the tool's life cycle. You'll need to understand whether the tool is making decisions based solely on automated processing, and therefore whether Article 22 applies. If it does apply, ensure you have a lawful basis and provides routes for human intervention and human review. As outlined on the previous slide, ensure that GDPR duties are met, including conducting a DPIA. Regardless of whether the process is solely automated, good practice includes many steps, such as to explain that an automated tool is being used and create a clear appeals process, including a point of contact for human intervention and review. Prepare to explain the factors that went into the data-driven decisions and to provide documentation from the vendor about the process. Consider providing a non-automated alternative to the tool with human review. Where feasible, run a dip sample of applications examined by the two systems to ensure equivalence, and communicate the broad criteria for success and the basis for decisions clearly and meaningfully to candidates. Next slide, please. So the final stage is around building trust and communicating effectively. When using a data-driven tool in hiring, it can be difficult for vacancy holders to understand why decisions are made and to communicate the process with candidates. Similar to traditional hiring processes, data-driven systems may use factors that are unknown to vacancy holders or candidates. Communicating effectively and proactively about how data-driven tools are used can improve trust in these systems and the organisations that use them. Even if in practice a data-driven tool is more standardised and tested than traditional methods, technological tools can elicit public trust concerns about fairness, transparency and privacy, as well as how to navigate online systems. We suggest that to do this well, you consult with groups that represent marginalised individuals when exploring the use of data-driven tools. For example, you could run a challenge panel with your diversity and inclusion network, trade union reps and interested staff. You should communicate relevant aspects of how the system works in plain language to candidates, explaining how they can prepare for success, and provide contact information in case they face technical issues. It's important that there are channels for feedback about candidate experience. That way you can understand how the tool is working in practice. Proactively communicating a tool's purpose and the risk mitigations you've put in place can help build trust. This might include publishing documentation such as your DPIA, an algorithmic impact assessment if you've used one, or a register of tools being used in the workplace. So that's it for the bulk of the guidance. I would really encourage you to read it and use it. We'd be happy to have a conversation if there are areas you're not sure about or if you have further questions. But next slide, please. Just before I hand back to Kevin, I want to flag that in addition to the generalised guidance, we have produced 3 tool-specific guides. So these are on targeted online advertising, asynchronous video interview assessment tools, and automated sifting tools. These are also available on the REC website. So each one should be read alongside the guidance I've just run you through, but they focus on additional considerations specific to those tools. These 3 were chosen as they have a spread across the recruitment lifecycle from sourcing to sifting to interview. So yeah, I think that's everything on the content of the guidance for me. So thanks for listening, everyone. And Kevin, back to you.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful, and I hope that you've learned some insights and some questions that you can pose to your technology vendors when selecting tech to power your businesses. Okay, so next slide, please. I will take you through some of the resources that are available to you now. By the way, the polls were very interesting. It's encouraging to see that it is on the agenda. AI assurance is on the agenda for some of you. I think if we ran that poll maybe a year ago, the numbers would have been much lower. I think really one of the issues around this is, why is it important, right? What's the big deal with AI assurance? Why do we need it? Well, because it's really this is unregulated technology. Okay, so a lot of the risk will lie with the user, right, or your clients. For example, they will have perhaps a larger brand than a recruitment agency. You just have to look at what happened with Estee Lauder not that long ago. The BBC ran a documentary on it. They used recruitment technology to assess their employees, and they fired those that didn't make the grade, and it was deemed unfair, and a case was brought against them, and of course they took that reputational hit as well. So we need to make sure that the tech that we invest in and use is responsible. Okay, and that's why we're arming you with these questions. So we threw a lot at you here today, right? If any of this you would feel that you would be more comfortable talking with an external expert in this space, get in touch with Centigy, with myself. So what I've popped into the chat there now is an Armstrong Craven. They are a recruitment agency. They were 60 employees. They grew to 100 over the 18 months that I worked with them. And their brief to me was, we want to use technology to create a competitive advantage, right? We ended up building some technology with them. They have their own proprietary tech now, and they follow all of the ethical guidelines, and it's a fantastic case study. Please have a look at that. It's in the chat now. I'll also add in this excellent guide, which you've seen a snapshot of here today, which was built in collaboration between the CDEI and REC, and that is the buyer's guide, the technology buyer's guide, called Data-Driven Tools in Recruitment Guidance. So I'll just pop that into the chat now. And if you were watching the replay, it'll be in the About section. Here we go. Number 3 is the industry temperature report. I'll add that in also. And lastly, CDEI are very good to their members. So sorry, I mean the REC are very good to their members, and they're very persuasive. And they have asked me to commit some free advisory sessions to REC members. So I've committed free advisory sessions up to 2 hours for the first 5 REC members who apply. I'm going to put my Calendly link in here. Book it. I'm a resource of yours. If you're looking at selecting new tech, if you want to do a review of your existing tech stack, or like Armstrong Craven, you're thinking you're going to build your own proprietary technology, I can help you with that. Okay, so there it is. We're going to now move on to the Q&A session. So I'm just going to have a look at some of the questions that have come through. And the first one is for the CDEI team, and it is around CV screening. Okay, so what are the risks and maybe limitations of CV screening technology? So Sarah and Nuala.
I'll come in on this one, and I think Sarah has done a lot of work in this space as well, so if I miss anything, please do come in. I think CV screening, again, obviously it can be made really efficient, but depending on kind of how the algorithm is trained, if you're training on historical data, then it can continue to kind of perpetuate historical biases. So for example, there was a pretty famous example a few years ago where a company started to kind of pick out CVs where applicants had played lacrosse as being correlated with doing a good job, because many of the kind of successful applicants in the past happened to have that on their CV as well. Whereas in that case, playing lacrosse had nothing to do with how well you would actually perform that job. So there's definitely a risk of kind of misrepresenting the skills that you're actually trying to recruit for. And then conversely, on the other side, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but people can also game some of those systems. So for example, if you know that the job you're applying for is probably going to be looking for CVs with particular keywords, you could like write those keywords and like put them in white so that you can't actually pick them up, or you haven't actually kind of done that job, but in a screening kind of process that's being run by an algorithm, it might still be selected as a kind of a successful CV. So not having that kind of human in the loop to review does definitely risk that the qualities that are being picked up aren't the right ones, or that the person doesn't maybe actually have the skills that somehow are being picked up on that CV. So again, I would say like really similar in terms of risks of perpetuating historical bias and discrimination. But Sarah, if you have anything else to add, please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. I think you've mostly covered it. I just say often those tools are also trained to be prescriptive, so they can't account for kind of the array of different ways candidates might articulate their suitability. So, for example, a candidate might use a synonym in place of an exact keyword that particular CV screening is searching for, and therefore be unnecessarily rejected from the process. And it means recruiters might miss out on suitable candidates. Similarly, if a candidate has a sort of non-standard formatting on their CV, they might include graphics, for example, the tool might downrank them at their application where they might otherwise meet the job criteria. So essentially, again, you're just missing out on candidates that might be relevant just because the tool hasn't been able to pick up on how relevant they are for you.
Also, does the tool understand what good looks like, what a good candidate looks like, and how relevant is their training data? So are they working off a skills taxonomy that was perhaps last updated a few years ago? And you know, the half-life of skills is shortening all of the time. The skills we have today won't be as valid in 2 years' time, right? And we'll have to replace them with new skills. So is it localized as well, is another question I would ask. Is it a skills taxonomy from the United States? Does that work in London? You know, if you're hiring the same person in 2 different parts of the world, is it the same skill set? Is it the same type of individual you're looking for? Not necessarily. So I think you have to really kind of customize what does good look like, right, at a local level to make this really work.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. And again, it's why we suggest sort of having this human intervention, human testing of the outputs that you're getting from the CV sifting. So take a pool and test it against those that have been reviewed by a human and see where your biases might be coming out, where the tool might be not picking up on relevant candidates. But localized testing is also really important, Kevin.
Thanks very much for that. If anyone has any other questions, please pop them in the chat. Patrick, I have one for you and I to tackle. It's a two-parter, and it's around what everybody's talking about right now, and that's ChatGPT. So have you seen any examples of how ChatGPT is being used well in recruitment? And the second part is what risks do you see that it poses? I'll take the risks if you want to give us some insights into how it's being used.
Yeah, it's fine. So in terms of how it's being used, there are a couple of obvious areas where ChatGPT can be used. For those of you who aren't familiar with ChatGPT, this is an AI chatbot that's gone a little bit viral, I would say, recently, where you can ask it prompts and it replies with answers. And so in the recruitment industry, you could use that to write job adverts. You know, you could say, I need you to write a job advert working in X industry with certain skills that need to be included, and it would provide a copy for you on that. Likewise, if you were writing job descriptions to send out, again, you could say, can you produce me a job description for, I don't know, a teacher, and it would come back with various qualifications and skills in the format of a job description that it thought a teacher would need. In terms of the risks around these, it's difficult to know where ChatGPT is pulling its information from in terms of sourcing what it thinks should be included in a job advert for a particular role or a job description for a particular role. It may be that the sources are out of date and it's using old information, and if you looked carefully, you'd see that the qualifications or training that it said were necessary were no longer applicable, for example. Or it could be that they're using data from a source where bias hasn't been taken into account, and it will continue to perpetuate, you know, gendered language in job adverts and stuff like that, or discriminatory job language in job adverts, which we know can be an issue when humans write adverts as well. Kevin, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, if you've used it, I think it's more useful for people who have a bit of experience in the role that they're doing, right? Otherwise, I think there's a risk of over reliance on the information that's provided to you. A lot of the time when you give it a query, I don't know if you've noticed this yourself, Patrick, Nuala, Sarah, the first answer is not really, it's not on point, right? So if you're looking for a job description, you have to tailor it. Yeah, and you have to use a bit of common sense. So I think that's a bit of a risk from a recruitment point of view. Yes, it's great for copy, and I think it's great for really brainstorming and improving some efficiencies. But the information isn't always right, okay? And if we're going to copy and paste that information, it could cause more problems down the line. So that's what I would see from that's from a recruitment point of view. I think from a wider perspective, it's unregulated technology, right? A lot of people are relying on this, relying on the answers. There is certainly a risk for mass manipulation. It's a tool like any other, right? It's the same as social media, which is open to that as well, but it has the potential to cause some damage in that respect. But I use it, and I think it's, I use it with a pinch of salt. I think it's great. All right, we've one other question. I think we've covered the CV parsing one. So from Sharon, thanks for the useful information this morning. In your view, which AI tools are most positively impactful in the recruitment process in terms of time saving and improving the candidate and client experience? I can give an answer on that, but Sarah and Nuala, I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, do you want to go first, or do you want me to come in?
You go ahead.
Okay, cool. I guess really wary of endorsing specific tools, but I think in terms of probably having the least potential for harms, I think sourcing and screening tools with appropriate oversight and kind of human in the loop in terms of efficiency can be really, really useful. I think one that we are a bit more worried about in terms of kind of ethical impact, or some of the tools we've seen around kind of video interviews, particularly around kind of emotion detection. I think that can be really dangerous because it's not kind of grounded in scientific fact, and again can be really discriminatory because people express emotion really differently, particularly neurodivergent people who might not kind of make eye contact with the camera in the same way, and I think there's a lot of correlation between certain kind of physical behaviors and particular emotions, which again, as I said, not scientifically proven. So I think using those kind of video interview tools to make certain decisions around who has the right behaviors for particular jobs is something that we think is really ethically tricky and probably not something that we would promote use of. Whereas the sourcing and the screening tools, again, I think still based on training data can have historical biases, but I think easier to mitigate and kind of put the appropriate safeguards in place for those. And I think that reflects today kind of the use that we've seen, and that people tend to be using AI-enabled tools more in the kind of beginning of the recruitment phase rather than for interview and selection. Whereas again, you're probably dealing with a smaller pool of people, you're making a bigger decision. And so you want to make sure that you have kind of somebody in the room who is interpreting kind of those tools and making sure that they're being used in the right way. Kevin, not sure if you have anything else to add.
I would completely agree with that, and I think I'm seeing a lot of use for sourcing tools. And again, like you know, I'm completely agnostic when it comes to technology, so I wouldn't endorse anyone in particular. But sourcing tools can save a lot of time, depending on the type of business that you have. I mean, if it's, if you're looking for talent maps, it's almost instant, right? Whereas in the past, it would have taken how many hours to build up that talent map, who's actually available out there. So I think the sourcing tools are great, but you need to also be careful in the usage of them. They are a tool, right? So we need to have good governance in place so that you can find the right type of talent and it's ethically sourced. And that responsibility lies on the recruiter. I think they're excellent. And in terms of candidate and client experience, well, chatbots, right? That's an easy one. That's a quick win, because it's more engaging and you can connect with more candidates. But if you really want to improve the experience, all of these tools that you're using, they need to be integrated, right? They need to be talking to one another. You need to have one flawless system where it's a continuous flow of data. And no duplication internally, so that your recruiters, your delivery teams are actually going to use the tech. All right, I think they're all our questions today. So thank you very much to everyone who has joined. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you to all our panelists, Nuala, Patrick and Sarah. Great session. Thank you.
So thank you to you as well, Kevin. And again, thank you to the guys from the CDEI. A recording of this webinar will be made available. So do keep an eye out for that as well, everyone. Thank you.